Please welcome research scholar at the NYU Libraries, Michael Konsiewicz. Thank you. Hi, Michael. Good to see you. The author of, well, I'll let you go. They said no to Nixon, Republicans who stood up to the president's abuses of power.
Well, thank you, Joan. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk to your community. I always love talking to people who support public libraries. As a kid, I considered my local public library a second home. So they're important parts of our communities. And so I thank all of you for attending this event. I'm going to begin my talk with an audio clip with a conversation that actually is featured in the introduction to my book. And it's a conversation that took place on August 3rd, 1972. Just to provide a little bit of context, this is roughly 6 weeks after the infamous Watergate break-in. It took place the night of June 16th, early morning hours of June 17th. Weirdly enough, my birthday is actually June 16th. So it's the summer of 1972. Watergate has happened, but it's not a national story. The 1972 election is, of course, coming up, and Nixon ends up winning in a landslide over Senator George McGovern. But in August of 1972, Nixon doesn't think that Watergate's going to become a national story. Instead, he's trying to find ways to increase the powers of the presidency. And so he has this conversation, which I'll explain in a little bit after I play this audio clip. But remember, August 3rd, 1972.
But you got the facts, so they check the other side of the facts, and what is being done, and who is doing this full time? That's what I'd like to know. Who's running the IRS? Who's running over the Justice Department? So what I meant is, with all the agencies of government, what in the name of God are we doing about them, what the government contributes? I think short answer to your question is nothing. And we are. Boy, they're doing it to us. No question. And it's never happened that way before. I can give you Johnson screwed everybody. Ken had. And when we were out in 52, the Truman people were kicking the hell out of me. Sure. In 62, they kicked the hell out of me. In 1960, the bureaucracy leaked stuff on my visit with Khrushchev. The Eisenhower bureaucracy. I got that part of the problem is the bureaucracy, but part of the problem is our own goddamn fault. There must be something that we can do. I don't disagree. Now, where's Nixon? Is he around? Do we enlist him or anybody to do this kind of work? I think the trouble is we got too many nice guys around. We just want to do the right thing. Well, it's very interesting. Well, we tried to do it and failed, really, isn't it? We got a guy who's a pluperfect bastard. He's a loyalist. He's a fanatic loyalist in the IRS. And he's our guy. One Treasury Secretary after another, starting with Kennedy, Connolly, now Schultz, have said, oh, Jesus, can't you get this guy out of there? Can't you just take him out of there? He's making all kinds of trouble for us. He's too partisan. He's too loyal. Now, one thing about Schultz is that Schultz is not long for this life, in my opinion, because he's not being political enough. I don't care how nice a guy is. I don't care how good an economist he is. We can't have this bullshit. Well, the interesting thing is
so that, of course, is one of the many expletive deleted conversations that people may or may not remember. But to just provide a little more context, once again, the conversation is taking place in August 1972. Nixon's marching towards a landslide victory, and he's trying to find ways to use the IRS to go after his political opponents. This is something that maybe many of you are already vaguely aware of, but the details don't get talked about nearly enough. Next to the Watergate break-in and the 18.5-minute gap and a few other famous events or moments of the Watergate saga, people are also aware that there was an enemies list. Nixon had an enemies list and he used it to punish his enemies. And because people are cynical about well, Nixon, but also just the federal government in general, I think a lot of people assume that that project was actually carried out. Well, it wasn't. Yes, maybe a few politically motivated audits got through the system, but the reason that you didn't have massive audits against Nixon's opponents was because of the two gentlemen you see right here. That's George Shultz, who that summer was the Secretary of the Treasury, and Johnny Walters, the Commissioner of the IRS. He's the gentleman on the right. You can see him during his swearing in ceremony. And both of them are providing important roadblocks to Nixon's enemies list project. Starting in 1971, Richard Nixon and his aides started to, well, actually compile an enemies list. And at first, it was meant to only act as a do not invite list. Do not invite these individuals to White House functions. We can debate whether or not that's important or not, but it's not nearly as sinister as what happens next. Over time, especially by the time you get to 1972, that enemies list had come to, you had about 500 to 600 individuals on that list. These are prominent journalists, anti-war activists, civil rights activists. You name it. Paul Newman was on the list for his political activities. And so you had 500 to 600 individuals whose only crime, in the president's view, was opposing his presidency. These were not organizations where you can make some sort of legitimate argument that they were violating some sort of tax status. No, these were individuals whose only crime, I'm going to repeat it again, was opposing the Nixon presidency. This idea was first brought to the IRS in the summer of 1972, specifically in September of 1972, when Johnny Walters met with then White House counsel John Dean to discuss this project. Johnny Walters and John Dean had worked together in the Justice Department before under then Attorney General John Mitchell, another controversial figure. And John Dean used his sort of friendship with Johnny Walters to set up a meeting. And he gave Johnny Walters the enemies list and told him that he would like for him, as the head of the IRS, to initiate audits against hundreds and hundreds of individuals as soon as possible. So this is September of 1972. We're in September of 2020. This is just weeks away from the 1972 election. So it's an incredibly dangerous order. And fortunately for the good of the country, Johnny Walters, a Republican Nixon appointee, a Republican from South Carolina, someone who worked under John Mitchell, was appointed by Richard Nixon himself in 1971. He recognized the danger of this order, and he said no. He rejected it. And he told John Dean that he would take the order to his boss, George Shultz, and tell him that he was not going to carry it out. John Dean made sure to mention in that meeting that this order came from his boss. And Johnny Walters knew that that meant either the President of the United States or his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman. And if it came from H.R. Haldeman, it might as well have come from Richard Nixon. So Johnny Walters, this is a brave order, because remember, Nixon is fairly popular in the summer and fall of 1972. He wins more than 60% of the popular vote in November. And Walters knows that this is a pretty risky move if he wants a future, if he wants to continue to work as a civil servant. He also knows that he has a bit of a complicated relationship with George Shultz. That summer, George Shultz had actually caved to an order that came from the Nixon White House. And that order was to bring in Larry O'Brien. Many of you may know that he was the target of the White House, of the Watergate break-in. Larry O'Brien was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. So the Watergate burglars were breaking into his office in June of 1972. Well, that summer, Nixon is also pressuring the IRS to bring him in for an interview because he's convinced that they can find dirt that they can use to ruin Larry O'Brien's career. Walters refuses and says he's not going to bring in Larry O'Brien until November or December of 1972, after the election, when he thinks it's more appropriate to do so. But Nixon and his aides continue to pressure the IRS, and they then pressure George Shultz, who had just become Secretary of the Treasury that June. Shultz caves, even though he tried to slow down this order, and the archives show that he was not thrilled about it. He decides to tell Johnny Walters, you have to do this. Walters was infuriated by this order, but he took the order. They brought in Larry O'Brien that August and interviewed him. O'Brien was pretty intimidated by the whole experience. But after the investigation concluded that summer, they discovered that Larry O'Brien actually was owed a small refund on his taxes. They reported their findings. They reported their findings to the Nixon White House, and Richard Nixon was furious. He did not accept the results of the investigation. Nevertheless, this caused a bit of tension between Johnny Walters and George Shultz. So when it came time to tell George Shultz that he would not carry out the White House's enemies list project, Walters did not know what Shultz was going to say. He knew that Shultz was an ambitious figure, someone who liked to, cozy up to the boss. That's how Johnny Walters later described him. So he was pretty nervous when he met with George Shultz that September. When he walked into Shultz's office, he then learned that Shultz was on his side.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
And what he discovered was that Shultz actually also recognized that this was an incredibly dangerous order.
I'm okay. Carrie was on the phone.
Joan, I can hear you. Oh.
Yeah, I was able to get a connection again. All right, you might want to go off because you're on the screen. Okay, bye-bye.
Well, so George Shultz tells Johnny Walters that he is on his side and that he's going to tell the White House that the buck stops here. And that's what happens. The order dies. You can hear Nixon griping about this in September of 1972, saying once again, who does George Shultz think he is? He didn't get this job because he has nice blue eyes. I'm paraphrasing what Richard Nixon actually said in September of 1972. But what happens in the end is that George Shultz and Johnny Walters, two conservative Republicans who were each Nixon appointees, blocked one of Nixon's most dangerous orders. Because just imagine what could have happened if Nixon actually had full control over the IRS in 1973, before Watergate became a national story in the spring of 1973. This could have intimidated hundreds and hundreds of people who opposed his presidency. So what my book does for the first time ever is tell these stories in great detail, using recently released archival records, placing a heavy emphasis on hundreds of hours of Nixon White House tapes. There's 3,700 hours in total. I've listened to probably about 200 to 300. And in those tapes, you can see that when Nixon was actually stopped from expanding the powers of his presidency, it was because of good, honest civil servants. It was because of good government Republicans. And another story that's told for the first time in my book is the time that civil servants within the Office of Management and Budget, an office in the White House that was in the news quite a bit during the Trump impeachment saga, stopped Nixon's order to punish colleges and universities with sizable anti-war movements. So the beginning of this story goes back to 1970. After the invasion of Cambodia, you see anti-war protests explode across the country. You have the tragic shooting that takes place at Kent State, later on at Jackson State University, and hundreds of colleges and campuses closed down. You also see a lot of sympathetic statements coming from some of the more elite universities, at least from their presidents. You have a lot of Ivy League presidents condemning the president's actions in Cambodia. And that angers Richard Nixon. And so he comes up with this plan to cut off federal funds to universities who receive Defense Department funds. So at the top of this list in 1970, 71, 72 is MIT, which at that time was receiving roughly about $100 million a year in DoD funds. And so what anti-war students that you can see a picture on your screen, or at least you should, this is a photograph of a protest at MIT in front of one of the laboratories where research was conducted on different weapons that would then later be used in Vietnam. And these protesters wanted to demilitarize their campus and shut down these labs. What they didn't know was that Nixon was, weirdly enough, on their side for very, very different reasons. While they were very interested in demilitarizing campuses across the nation, Nixon wanted to punish schools that he detested and reward schools that he identified as being pro-Nixon. So there are numerous tapes, dozens of tapes, where Nixon wants to take away the funds from MIT, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, the University of California system, and give those funds to pro-Nixon schools, or at least schools that he thinks are pro-Nixon in the Midwest and the South. This is a plan that comes up over and over and over again. The interesting thing about this story is that some Nixon scholars often dismiss some of these conversations as Nixon just letting off steam, as Nixon simply just ranting and raving, locker room talk, trying to impress his aides with some tough masculine talk. And this order initially was dismissed by scholars as just another example of that. It's just one of Nixon's crazy ideas that was never followed up on. The problem, though, is that recently released archival documents show that after 2 years of ranting and raving, Nixon's aides, who initially ignored this order, started to actually move ahead with it in the spring and summer of 1972. This is a phone call that took place on May 18th, 1972, between Richard Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman.
Before you go into that for a second, I just want to mention that one of the audience members said, my family were members of the Unitarian Church when I was a little girl. Any member, including my parents, who signed a petition against the Vietnam War got audited by the IRS.
Well, there you go. And as I said, it was not a perfect system. What I'm saying is it could have been much worse.
Yeah.
But certainly, yes, there were politically based audits, and it happened especially at the organizational level. And but yeah, thank you for sharing that experience, because you're not the first person to tell me that. And that just gives you a sense of the effect of this pressure. If people who are working at the IRS know that the White House wants this, but their supervisor doesn't want it, they still may decide to go ahead and do it and try to just hide it from their boss. And I think that's what was happening in 1971 and 72. But this is a conversation that takes place May 18th, 1972, 2 years after Nixon is first recorded saying that he wants to punish MIT and other schools. And what's happening in this conversation is he has just discovered that Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, later on Secretary of State, had invited the presidents of the Ivy League into the White House without his permission. Henry Kissinger, of course, was a product of the Ivy League. He wanted to maintain those connections. And even though he was arguing with a lot of his former colleagues, he decided it was a nice gesture to bring him into the White House to air their grievances. Nixon did not want that. And so he discovers that Kissinger did this. He's reminded of an order that has been slow-walked by his advisors that spring. And so he calls H.R. Haldeman and he says, one thing that Ehrlichman, that's John Ehrlichman, his top domestic advisor, has been dragging his feet on, and George Shultz, and now we got Shultz the hell out of OMB, I want you to get Weinberger. That's Caspar Weinberger. I want those funds cut off for that MIT. Did you? H.R. Haldeman says, right, I know what you mean. Nixon says, now, all right, you get a hold of Weinberger and say, I want the funds. I want them to know it now. Get it done. Haldeman says, right. Nixon says, okay. Haldeman says, okay. And what happens over the next several months is that you have evidence, both on the tapes and in textual documents, that Caspar Weinberger, the new head of OMB, is finding ways where this order can actually be implemented. in 1973. Now, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Weinberger, a former aide to then Governor Reagan, but then became the head of OMB in 1972, under Richard Nixon, he wasn't thrilled about it. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that he knows that this is a politically dangerous order. But unlike George Shultz, his predecessor, who stopped the order that spring, he did not compromise, he stopped it. Weinberger is moving it along, and he's meeting with the president and showing how he could actually use his powers to gradually cut funds to MIT and eventually reward other schools that have less of an anti-war movement. So what this story shows is that, yes, Nixon sometimes would erupt and just have tantrums, but those tantrums would sometimes matter in significant ways. So this is a bit of a counter to some of the arguments you see that are made either by Nixon loyalists or sometimes more credibly by serious Nixon scholars. And so what happens with this order? Well, by the time you get to early 1973, Nixon has won a second term. He's riding high. His approval rating is above 60%. And Weinberger is continuing to meet with the president about how they can actually punish MIT and all the schools that Nixon hates from the Ivy League. But they realize they need more institutional support to actually carry out this order. So the order is then passed down to 3 assistant directors from the OMB. 2 of them are Republicans and 1 is an independent. The 2 Republicans are Paul O'Neill, Kenneth Dam is the other one, and then the independent is William Morrill. Paul O'Neill is probably the most famous of the 3. He later served as Secretary of the Treasury under George W. Bush and famously resigned in protest because he disagreed with George W. Bush's environmental and economic policies. But back in the Nixon era, he was an assistant director in the OMB, kind of a rising star, at least within the bureaucracy. And he and his 2 colleagues, Kenneth Dam and William Morrill, refused this order. They not only refused the order, they threatened to go to the press because they thought it was totally out of bounds and was something that the president shouldn't be able to do without getting some sort of authorization from Congress. They then go to their former boss, George Shultz, which is interesting. They didn't go to their current supervisor, Caspar Weinberger. They went to George Shultz, who they knew had more of an independent streak. He tells them that he'll support them, and he'll tell H.R. Haldeman that if you actually push them, they will go to the press. The order then fades away in early 1973, and Watergate becomes a national story in April of 1973. The only other time this order comes up in the archives is June of 1973. There's a conversation where Nixon is in a cabinet meeting. George Shultz is right there. The 2 of them had never directly talked about this order. They had only indirectly talked about it through Nixon's aides. But Nixon in this meeting makes a very awkward joke where he says, well, George Shultz, you know, I hate MIT, but Shultz is loyal to them. So he prevented me from punishing them. And that's the only other time you see this come up in the archive. And it shows that once Watergate hits, and once the 3 assistant directors, Paul O'Neill, William Morrill, and Kenneth Dam, resist this order, other more loyal figures to Nixon start to back away. Once again, this order shows that you cannot dismiss things that just seem like Nixon ranting and raving. Instead, it sometimes suggests that, you know, it's a serious plan to expand the powers of the presidency. Now, the most famous Republican to say no to Nixon is the gentleman you see right here. This is Elliot Richardson. Elliot Richardson was in many ways the embodiment of the old, moderate, some would even say liberal establishment of the Republican Party. Born and raised in Boston, he's a Brahmin, he's a product of the Ivy League. If anyone here ever saw Elliot Richardson talk, he seems like he's from a totally different era. Can't imagine him existing in 2020. But he was brought into the Nixon administration in 1969. First as Assistant Secretary of State in 1969. Then was the head of HEW, Health of Education and Welfare. It's now HHS. Then a brief stint as Secretary of Defense, But that brief stint was interrupted because he was selected in the spring of 1973 to become Attorney General of the United States. This is just as Watergate is starting to gain momentum. This is when Richard Nixon's closest aides, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, along with John Dean and then Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, all leave. All are either forced to resign or are fired. And so you have this very dramatic exodus from some of Nixon's top advisors, and Nixon knows he's on the ropes. He knows that he needs to select someone as Attorney General that has credibility. And it's an interesting contrast to today, where a Republican president feels like in 1973 that he has to please the quote-unquote establishment, meaning people in the media, but also more centrist or moderate figures within the Republican Party. This, of course, leads to the Saturday Night Massacre, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And over the last 3.5 years, nearly 4 years, we've had one moment after another where pundits will often say, this is the new Saturday Night Massacre. It's a Friday Night Massacre. It's a Tuesday Night Massacre. We've had at least 10 or 15 of them in the last 3.5 years. But the most famous of which is arguably the firing of Jim Comey, director of FBI, former director of the FBI, in the spring of 2017. And when that happens, you actually see a lot of comparisons between that act and what happens during the Saturday Night Massacre. So once again, let's return to Elliot Richardson, because I think he's a very important figure that is not only someone who makes a courageous stand in 1973, but someone who I think really represents some of the main themes of this book, meaning kind of a clashing approaches to governance and why the more moderate-minded Republicans within the Nixon administration provided a serious roadblock to Nixon's authoritarianism. So I already described the basics of his bio, but I want to point out this one quote that Nixon says in a private conversation in the fall of 1972. He's about to win his second term, and he's deciding who he should keep in his administration. Richardson at that point was the head of HEW. As a more liberal Republican, he actually butted heads with the Nixon White House. Nixon often gets a lot of credit for being the president who creates the EPA, supports a lot of, by today's standards, liberal policies. But often gets ignored is that the people who are really pushing those policies were outside of the White House. And Nixon often tried to find ways to rein in the more moderate or liberal members of his administration. And that's especially true with Elliot Richardson. As the head of HEW, Elliot Richardson was actually in favor of a fairly progressive busing plan that Nixon opposed. And this created some public drama where reporters asked Elliot Richardson, well, what are you going to do if Richard Nixon tells you to back down? Well, what he does is he decides to back down. He caves. And even though Nixon is not thrilled about the fact that the media knew that they had serious policy disagreements, he does back down. Another time he backs down is when Elliot Richardson and his aides at HEW are supporting a federal funding for childcare, where you actually would have serious federal subsidies for childcare centers across the country. This is a huge policy battle within the administration in late 1971. So once again, a Republican in 1971 is backing federal childcare centers. That tells you just how this era was dramatically different from 2020. Nixon waffles a bit on this issue, but in the end, he decides to listen to his more conservative advisors, especially his speechwriter, Pat Buchanan, who tells him that if you accept this plan, you'll be marching down the same path that the Soviet Union did during the 20th century, that this was a socialist plan that will ruin our families and our education system. So Nixon rejects it, and Richardson backs down. So even though you have these serious policy disagreements, Richardson is proving to be a loyal soldier during times of crisis. He also did a very similar thing during the Cambodia invasion, whereas the number two in the State Department, Richardson defended Nixon's decision to invade Cambodia, even though he had serious reservations, and some of his top aides actually resigned in protest. So you have nearly, well, actually at that point, you have 3.5 years of evidence that Richardson, yes, he may have an independent streak, but he'll back down and he's loyal to the president when he has to be. So in the fall of 1972, you get this quote where Nixon says, I suppose you've got to keep one person in the government that's considered to be sort of interested in the people. You see, he has that. And if you were to listen to the tape, you would not hear any laughter. It's Nixon and his aides. John Ehrlichman is in the room. H.R. Haldeman in the room. They're quite serious. And that tells you a lot about their cynicism, about how they view Elliot Richardson. He's someone who gives their administration credibility, but they do not trust him. Nevertheless, Nixon, when he's on the ropes in the spring of 1973, feels like Elliot Richardson is the only person who can give his administration credibility as Watergate is picking up steam. So he selects him to be Attorney General of the United States. From the start, it's a contentious relationship. Actually, a day after Richard Nixon picks Elliot Richardson, and a few weeks before his official swearing-in ceremony, the FBI is inside of the White House and is actually seizing documents that were left behind by Nixon's aides. Richard Nixon wakes up, sees these FBI agents in the White House, and actually shoves one of them and orders them to leave because he thinks this is a incredibly insulting move that was done by the FBI that was also approved by the Justice Department. Richardson was aware of the order, even though he was officially Attorney General. And so on Richardson's very first day, he's confronted by a president who has no interest in having a real, credible investigation into his alleged wrongdoings. Weeks later, it's like about an hour or two after Richardson's swearing-in ceremony, you have this conversation that takes place between Richard Nixon and Elliot Richardson, where, and I'm not going to read every line, but what takes place in this conversation is they're talking about personnel in the Justice Department, and Nixon awkwardly changes the subject. He says, you never know when somebody's going to die, you know. By that, I mean, I'm speaking of the Supreme Court. The point I should make is this. I have a very close relationship with the Chief Justice. He will like it. He have any problem with that? He's a very shrewd politician. I would hope that you could spend some time with him. I mean, in a proper way. So, as someone who's listened to a few hundred hours of these tapes, I can tell you that this is a bribe. Maybe it seems vague to some of you, or maybe not. There are at least 3 other conversations where Richard Nixon talks about dangling a Supreme Court appointment to try to get Elliot Richardson in line. He knows that Elliot Richardson is an ambitious figure. Elliot Richardson saw himself as a future president of the United States, even though he never arguably had the charisma to pull that off. He's an ambitious figure, and Nixon knows that. And so here he is, the same day as Elliot Richardson's swearing-in ceremony. He's telling him to have a close relationship with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Richardson does not respond. He changes the subject after a few more minutes of Nixon kind of rambling on. So the reason I play that, or the reason I show that to all of you, is that it's direct proof that Nixon never was interested in allowing a real investigation into his connection to Watergate. He wanted someone that would have credibility, that he could kind of dangle out there like a shiny new toy, but someone he could also control. And so that's who Elliot Richardson is in the spring and summer of 1973. Later that day, Nixon calls his new chief of staff, Al Haig, and complained that there were so many weak people in his cabinet. And he specifically targets Richardson and George Shultz, the two of the main characters of this book. He says, see, Richardson is in the spot, whereas, you know, he's going to have to prove that he's the white knight and all that bull. And so he's going to he and Archie Cox will try to try the president. You know, well, and all that crap. How do you handle that? Well, Nixon is right. Even though he's deeply cynical, he's right. Richardson, in the end, stands up and, fortunately for the good of the country, decides to be the white knight. He chooses loyalty to his country over loyalty to his party. And you have the Saturday Night Massacre in the fall of 1973. How do we get there? I'm not going to go over every single detail, but I think it's important to revisit some of the more important moments. Elliot Richardson, prior to his official confirmation, was told by Senate Democrats that you're only going to be confirmed if you actually create an independent office that will look into Watergate in the Justice Department. And that becomes the Watergate Special Prosecution Force. And so the next question is, well, who will Elliot Richardson select to be the head of this new office that will look into Watergate? That's a very important position. And Nixon loyalists to this day suggest that this was the beginning of a conspiracy, or at least part of a conspiracy to bring down the president of the United States, to reverse the results of the 1972 election. But if you look into the archives, you see a much more complicated story. Because in May of 1973, no one knows where this is going to go. We now know that Nixon was guilty, but people certainly did not know that in May of 1973. Elliot Richardson did not know that. He was bothered by some of the president's actions, but he still sincerely believed that Richard Nixon could be innocent. Well, he calls a lot of different people to take this job, and a lot of them reject his offer. Archibald Cox, who you see right here, is actually the 9th person who was offered the job. Because remember, this is a president who had just won a historic landslide. His approval rating is dropping, but it's either in the 40s or 50s in May and June of 1973. So it's certainly not seen as inevitable that he's going to resign in disgrace. But Cox, the former Solicitor General of the United States, he served under John Kennedy, was very close to the Kennedys, was actually Elliot Richardson's former law professor at Harvard. He accepts the offer and creates this new office. He hires a lot of young lawyers to work on his team. Nixon initially doesn't think much of him. They think he's someone that it can control. But during his swearing-in ceremony, Archibald Cox actually invites Ted Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy. So with the Kennedys there, Nixon aides then tell Richard Nixon, and he's enraged by this. He thinks that this is direct proof that you have a biased head of this new office who's going to try to bring down his presidency. So throughout the summer and fall of 1973, Richardson is trying to operate in between Cox and Richard Nixon. He's trying to be a fair arbiter where he can constantly try to get a compromise. That was his goal. He thought if he could find a fair compromise between these two sides, he would succeed. He was not interested in bringing down Richard Nixon. Well, one other important moment that summer, and many of you may remember this, we find out that there's a taping system that had recorded every single conversation from February of 1971 to July of 1973. We find this out during the Senate Watergate hearings. A former aide to the president, Alexander Butterfield, who left the Nixon White House in January of 1973, decides to not perjure himself and tell the truth and say, yes, there is a voice-activated, it's a very important point, a voice-activated taping system in the White House. He was one of only a few people who knew about the taping system. Nixon knew about it, H.R. Haldeman knew about it, and a few Secret Service agents knew about it. That's about it. This recorded 3,700 hours of conversations. And the last year of Watergate is essentially a battle over the tapes. And Archibald Cox is interested in listening to those tapes, specifically conversations that took place in the days and weeks after the Watergate break-in, that he believes will prove whether or not Richard Nixon is innocent or guilty of obstruction of justice. So Cox demands the tapes. The tapes are subpoenaed. He actually wins in the courts, but Nixon refuses to release the tapes. And so what happens during the Saturday Night Massacre is you have one final argument over the tapes. The Sunday before that infamous Saturday, you have a compromise plan that's pitched to Archibald Cox and to Elliot Richardson. Well, first to Richardson and then Cox. And that plan was known as the Stennis Compromise. And so this is an idea that that came from the Nixon White House. And here's the basics. Senator John C. Stennis, a Democrat, that doesn't sound so bad, right? But a Democrat who was a pro-Nixon Democrat, a Southern Democrat, a Dixiecrat, to use that term, would be the only person who would have access to the 9 tapes that were subpoenaed in the courts. He would listen to the tapes, he and his staff would then provide transcripts, and those transcripts would then be sent over to Archibald Cox. That would be the only access that Cox would get under the Stennis Compromise. So that's what's being pitched. And after months of arguments, Elliot Richardson, and you may call him naive, he sees this as something he can work with. And that shows just how much of a loyal moderate he was. He actually saw this as the beginning of a real negotiation that could lead somewhere. He brings the plan to Archibald Cox, and Cox says, no, I can't accept that. I would actually get more from continuing to battle it out in the courts. Why would I accept this? But Cox decides to say, well, but let's continue to talk about this. They tell the Nixon White House this, and the Nixon White House tells them, nope, that's our final offer. So once again, this shows you that both Elliot Richardson and Archibald Cox were interested in finding some sort of compromise that made sense, that gave him real access to the tapes. Nixon was not interested in that. And so that Friday, Richard Nixon tells Elliot Richardson to fire Archibald Cox for refusing to accept the Stennis Compromise. That is a stunning development for Elliot Richardson. He doesn't know what to do next. People, his closest aides, his wife, his kids, all say the same thing. He was not looking to resign, but after contemplating this decision for the entire night, he decides to resign on Saturday, October 20th, 1973. Archibald Cox goes live on TV that afternoon and tells the American people he's not going to accept the Stennis Compromise. He thinks that it's not right and that he should get more access to the tapes. And he does not know that Elliot Richardson is on his side until just a few minutes before he goes on TV. So he delivers this press conference, and he looks like this very kind of friendly professor in front of millions and millions of Americans on that Saturday. And the press is on his side. They think he's making a very reasonable argument. That same afternoon, Elliot Richardson goes to the White House and tells Richard Nixon, I will not carry out this order. I'm resigning in protest. And Richard Nixon tells Elliot Richardson, well, I'm sorry that you're putting the interests of your own career over the interests of the nation. And Richardson, who was a very calm, some perhaps would say a boring individual, was enraged by this, but he controls his anger and he says, Mr. President, I believe we have a disagreement over what's good for the country. And he leaves. The order then is sent to the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, William Ruckelshaus, who you see right here. He was only Deputy Attorney General for actually just about a month. He had previously served as the head of the EPA. He was the first head administrator of the EPA. In that position, he often battled it out with the Nixon White House, who wanted to rein in the powers of the EPA. And as an actual environmentalist, an actual liberal Republican, William Ruckelshaus wanted to, make sure that the EPA was an agency with teeth. So he already had a few years of experience of sort of having these quiet battles with the Nixon White House. And as the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, he's put in the middle of this controversy. But when he's given the order, he immediately says no. He tells people this is a pretty easy decision. He thinks that firing Archibald Cox is completely unethical. And so he says no. and he resigns in protest. But before he can officially turn in his resignation letter, the White House fires him. So he's officially fired before he resigns, if that matters. And the next person who's given this order is Robert Bork. He's the third in line. He's the Solicitor General of the United States. And up until that point, he did not even know that he was third in line. And so that shows you just how unprecedented this all was. These guys who are, veteran scholars or civil servants are figuring this out just days before the Saturday Night Massacre, trying to figure out what are they going to do next. Now, Robert Bork is a bit of a villain in the story because he actually pulls the trigger and he fires Archibald Cox. What many people don't know, or at least what most people don't know, is that both Elliot Richardson and William Ruckelshaus told Robert Bork to carry out the order and stay on as Attorney General for at least a few months. Now, why would they do that? Well, one, they knew that Robert Bork sincerely believed that the president had the right to do this. That as the head of the United States, as the head of, this is of course a conversation that's ongoing in terms of whether or not the president can be guilty of any crimes. Well, Robert Bork basically believed, no, the president's all powerful. He can do this. He has the power. And he actually wrote about it in an article the year before. So Richardson and Ruckelshaus told him, look, you have a proven record that you actually believe this. The other factor, though, and this is, I think, more interesting, and it shows you just how unprecedented this was, is that they were actually afraid of what Richard Nixon would do if Robert Bork also resigned in protest. They were afraid that Nixon would put in someone who would be even crazier than Robert Bork, I guess. And they believed that Bork was their best bet to preserve some sort of stability within the Justice Department. Because the other thing they feared were mass resignations within the Justice Department. So I bring this up because not only is it something that gets ignored when talking about the Saturday Night Massacre, it also shows you once again that Elliot Richardson and William Ruckelshaus are moderate, good government Republicans. They're not interested in bringing down the President of the United States. They're trying to find a moderate solution to these problems. They're not ideological creatures. They could have supported mass resignations in the Justice Department. They choose not to do that. I think that's interesting. That's important when evaluating the actions of these individuals. But Robert Bork does carry out the order. That same day, Nixon, and Bork talks about this, Nixon actually dangles a Supreme Court pick in front of Robert Bork, saying, I could pick you for the Supreme Court someday. and Robert Bork knows that that's probably not going to happen because he knew the president's days were numbered. But Bork does carry out the order, and Archibald Cox is fired. This causes a massive wave of rage across the country. This is when you have people actually starting to talk about impeachment in a serious way. Remember, it had been 105 years since the last impeachment in the United States, Andrew Johnson in 1867-68. And so this was seen as something that wasn't normal. But after the Saturday Night Massacre, you actually have a plurality for the first time. It's later a majority, but for the first time in October, you have a plurality of the American people who support impeaching Richard Nixon. Members of Congress start to openly talk about beginning impeachment proceedings. The White House and Capitol are besieged by hundreds of thousands of telegrams from the American people demanding that Richard Nixon be impeached. Cars drive around the White House honking in support of impeachment because you have protesters saying, honk if you support impeachment. And so this is a turning point, one that we haven't seen in the last few years. This is a very important turning point in terms of the public's attitude towards Richard Nixon and the idea of impeachment. And because of the reaction, because of the backlash, Richard Nixon actually selects a new Watergate special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, a lawyer from Texas, to continue the investigation. And in the end, to just kind of gloss over some of the details, he ends up being a more aggressive prosecutor than his predecessor, Archibald Cox. And he's the one that brings this investigation all the way to the Supreme Court, where in an 8-0 decision in July of 1974, with one justice abstaining, that's William Rehnquist, the Supreme Court tells Richard Nixon, you have to turn over the tapes. But we only get to that point because of the Saturday Night Massacre. Here's an image from the Saturday Night Massacre where you actually see police guards shutting down the Watergate Special Prosecution Office that October. This was an image that was broadcasted to the American people. And remember, back then, you only have 3 channels back then. So, I mean, tens of millions of people are watching this unfold on Saturday night. And it's given this very dramatic name, the Saturday Night Massacre. And of course, no one dies during the Saturday Night Massacre. But people sincerely felt that this was a dangerous moment for our democracy. We did not know in October of 1973, people did not know that Richard Nixon would eventually back down. So this was a stunning development for the Nixon presidency, but it's the beginning of the end. And what I argue in the book is that Elliot Richardson's actions are connected to the actions of other good government Republicans who worked inside the Nixon administration to rein in his authoritarian tendencies. Their stories are important, and I'm just going to conclude not only with this image of Richard Nixon and our current president, Donald Trump, the gentleman who's in between, maybe some of you recognize him, is former governor of Texas, John Connally, later on served as Nixon's Secretary of Treasury. He, along with Roger Stone, who of course is very famous now, were the ones who introduced Donald Trump to Richard Nixon in the 1980s when Nixon lived in New York. So aside from their profound cultural connections, and they actually were personal acquaintances. And I could talk maybe more about this in the Q&A, but I believe that matters. It's not a coincidence. But I'm going to end this presentation with just one selection from the book that I believe summarizes the importance of these stories. It is worth noting that very few in 1972 would have expected resistance from Republicans in the Nixon administration. With the help of new archival records, we now know the full scope of their actions. George Shultz, Johnny Walters, Kenneth Dam, William Morrill, Paul O'Neill, William Ruckelshaus, and Elliot Richardson all said no to the president because they were all fiercely dedicated to preserving a strong culture of nonpartisan civil service within the federal government. It was a culture that shaped their careers and is one that they felt was necessary to protect. While Nixon did not see any strength in the men who resisted his orders, their collective stand was powerful enough to block the president's attempts to institutionalize abuses of power. They chose integrity over loyalty, and as a result, Nixon was prevented from dramatically expanding his presidential powers. Nixon often complained that there were too many principled men in his administration, but there were also just enough nice guys to stop him from dramatically undermining constitutional democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Whoa, that's a very powerful ending. Does anyone have any questions? Doesn't seem anything. How long did it take you to write this book?
Well, that's an interesting question because a lot of people assume that I wrote this book in the last few years. This started off as a dissertation that began in 2011. The dissertation was completed in 2014. And then, of course, every year since then, it's become more and more relevant.
Yeah.
I think another important thing to bring up is that when I was a graduate student working on this dissertation, I was also working for the National Archives at the Richard Nixon Library, where I helped, I helped put together the library's exhibit on Watergate to try to explain Watergate to the general public, but especially to high school students and middle school students who tour the museum. So I think that experience definitely also influenced the direction of this project because I saw how our colleagues on the other side of the campus, the Nixon Foundation, these are friends and family members and loyalists, former aides to the president, how they would market Richard Nixon's legacy. And I believe that what's in the archives does a better job of explaining Nixon's legacy.
We have one question. How a young person like you, how come a young person like you is so interested in this matter?
Well, as I said, I think one important factor is the fact is that I worked at the Nixon Library, but even before that, I was always fascinated by Richard Nixon. He was someone that just always seemed different than other presidents in popular culture. As a young kid, I watched. I was a huge fan of The Simpsons, and he would pop up occasionally. I remember asking my father, "Well, who's that? Who's that strange-looking character?" You know, Richard Nixon's often compared to John F. Kennedy. You have the famous 1960 debate. Well, I always was curious about Nixon as an individual, but later on, I came to appreciate his impact, and I'll let everyone here decide if it's positive or negative. You can probably figure out what I think, but I came to appreciate just how influential of a figure he was on the late 20th century. And his influence is, of course, still with us to this day. Our political culture was at least partially shaped by his presidency.
No question about it. I think you wrote in the advertisement, in the publicity, how this bipartisan, problems we're having now could all be traced right back to what Nixon did.
Yeah, and I do believe that.
Yeah.
Now I think it is worth pointing out that Nixon is a more ideologically complicated figure than modern day Republicans, and that's true, and that's also part of his legacy. It does matter that he compromised with Democrats on environmental legislation.
Right.
He's the president that goes to China. That's certainly part of his legacy.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is that if you listen to the tapes, with the exception of China, the two things he's sincere about when it comes to his quote unquote liberal accomplishments or kind of moderate accomplishments are Native American affairs. He did care about that, and China. Those are two things where he deserves a lot of credit. With almost everything else, he's deeply, deeply cynical. And that's something that comes across on the tapes. People often talk about Nixon's racism, his anti-Semitism, and that is especially something that comes up over and over again on the tapes. I was never even seeking it out, but it comes up over and over again, and it's important. But what's even more important from my point of view is his cynicism and the constant scheming. It's something that I think if we had as much access to other presidents, we would probably see, but I don't think to this scale. Perhaps with our current president, but I think with other presidents, it's probably a mix of cynicism and sincerity. And one thing I think, not surprised, but maybe depressed about while listening to these tapes was just how cynical they are over and over again. Nixon and H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman. This is something that others have brought up, but it's true. You never hear, and Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who of course are in the news a lot over the last 48 hours, they bring this up a lot. And it's true that you never hear Nixon say, well, what's good for the country? You don't hear that at all in the tapes. And it's something that's worth pointing out. And I think it's something that has unfortunately shaped our modern political culture.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to point out that you've gotten a lot of congratulations of people who are typing it on the chat function, but two of them were from people from Mexico.
Oh.
Which I don't know if you have friends there, and I don't know how it goes, but we do have a lot of publicity that goes out, and we've never
I do have relatives, so it's probably my relatives in Mexico, so hello.
Okay. I just want you to know. Any other questions? Is there anybody who wants to make a comment or ask a question? Well, thank you, Michael. I certainly enjoyed it, learning about, another person. Yeah, you've gotten a lot of good, Monica just said excellent. Somebody else said fantastic, and thank you. So just so you know that there's a lot of people out there who are fascinated by this subject besides you. So thank you all for enlightening us, and thank you all for coming to the program.
Oh, and you can buy copies of the book at Scattered Books.